Well, thank you very much for your thoughtful testimony to all of our witnesses. Given the limited number of members, we may get several rounds of questioning, which is exciting to me. And I just want to say to Ms. Bickert, Ms. Culbertson, Ms. Veach, your efforts to downrank borderline content to improve transparency and empower users are all positive steps. And we need to continue to find ways to preserve the positive benefits of algorithms in showing content to people that's meaningful to them, while addressing the very clear threats and challenges, the very real potential for the harmful impacts of algorithmic amplification. So the questions I have today are meant to get a better understanding of how one might further build on your efforts and strike the right balance. Some have proposed that social media platforms create virality circuit breakers. We're all familiar with the phrase blowing up on the internet, to detect content that is rapidly gaining widespread viewership, so that humans can review whether it actually complies with platform policies before it racks up tens or hundreds of millions of views. Professor Donovan, could you just briefly, concisely explain why this kind of mechanism might be particularly valuable?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we know now from decades of tracking flagging, especially in communities, conspiracist communities, hate communities, they only tend to flag things as a result of trying to get retribution on one another. They search for this content and they enjoy it. And so systems that are built in don't tend to work when it comes to particular kinds of strategic misinformation, especially hate or harassing content as well. And so as a result, what you need to do as a corporation is really look for it. And I know that there have been a couple of different instances recently where corporations have found and rooted out some really heinous stuff, but it's obviously has to be part of the business process and the process of content moderation to seek out content that is essentially out of skew with signals from the past. So that's
Thank you.
That's one of the ways that they could incorporate this.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Bickert, Facebook said last fall it was piloting this very concept. What did you find through this experience, and do you expect to further roll this out more broadly? And please explain briefly, if you might.
Senator, thank you for the question. We do look at virality of content as a signal in when we should assess proactively, as Dr. Donovan is suggesting, whether or not something violates our policies or should be referred to our fact checkers. And the fact checkers, as you may know, are more than 80 independent fact-checking organizations that we work with. They can proactively rate content, or we can send it to them. Either way, and that could be based on user reports too. Either way, if they rate something false, then that's when we will put on that a label saying this content is false, directing people to the fact check, and will also reduce the distribution of that content in our newsfeed. And yes, we are seeing that those efforts are paying off. In fact, we see that when we put one of those informational labels on top of a piece of content, people are far less likely to actually click through and see the content than they would if we didn't have that label.
Ms. Bickert, I appreciated several steps Facebook announced it was taking just in advance of the Derek Chauvin verdict. One of these steps was limiting the spread of content, this is a quote from Facebook, that systems predict is likely to violate community standards in the areas of hate speech, graphic violence, and incitement. Facebook's statement also noted the company had done this in other emergency situations in the past. My question for you is why Facebook wouldn't always limit the rapid spread of content likely to violate these standards. Could you help us understand that?
Senator, yes. So what we're doing, and I put that blog post out. So what I meant by that was we use systems to proactively identify when content is likely to violate or is maybe borderline. And often what that can help us do is send that to our reviewers and have them assess whether or not it violates. In extreme situations, because of course not all of that content will violate. there will be some false positives in that. So there's a cost to, for instance, taking action on that content without having real people look at it. And so what we do is generally we use those measures to find content that we can send to reviewers. But in situations where we know that there is extreme and finite in terms of date risk, such as an election in a country that's going through civil unrest, or the situation in Minneapolis with the Chauvin trial, we'll put in place a temporary measure where we will de-emphasize content that the technology, that the algorithms say is likely to violate.
Let me ask a last question of the three social media representatives before I turn this to my ranking member. Ms. Bickert, Facebook has said, and I think you said in your opening statement, it's not in your long-term interest to pursue maximum engagement if it comes at the cost of spreading polarizing and sensationalized content, that it's not really long-term in the financial interest of the company, let alone its reputational interest, to have algorithms that amplify harmful or divisive content. And I agree with this. I am concerned about what the underlying incentives are at all three of your platforms for those who have to make decisions day in and day out about exactly how your companies operate. The MIT Technology Review reported last month that pay incentives at Facebook for employees broadly are still tied to growth metrics and engagement metrics. So if I'm a Facebook employee who works on its news feed, are the metrics the company has set up to measure my performance directly related simply to engagement and growth metrics, or is there some way that these broader, more positive social objectives are incorporated? If you could all three just answer briefly, Ms. Bickert for Facebook, Ms. Veach, and Ms. Culbertson, do you provide pay incentives in terms of your algorithm teams directly or indirectly based on engagement and growth-related metrics? Thank you.
Senator, the engineers are not specifically gold or given pay incentives simply to increase time on the site. The focus is really on making sure that the products are services that people find useful and will want to use for years to come.
Senator, for Twitter, a top priority for our company across our teams is to serve a healthy public conversation. And I'd love to share with you our transcript from our latest Analyst Day, which is what we share with our investors and our advertisers, and all of the concerns and priorities that we've talked about thus far today. You'll see that what we're telling you is exactly what we tell our investors and our advertisers, because they have the same concerns. We have no incentive to have a toxic or unhealthy conversation on the service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Similarly, Senator, so responsibility is our #1 priority. And when we set goals, we set those goals around what we define as responsible growth. So we may set a goal to encourage adoption of a feature, but also we want to take into account how that feature may be used or misused and how we can ensure it's adopted responsibly.
And Mr. Harris, if you could just provide a brief comment on your understanding of the incentives of employees and how it aligns with responsible growth versus growth at all costs.
Yes, my understanding is even to this day, I think there was a brief experimentation at Facebook with non-engagement-based performance incentives for social impact, but that those have largely gone away, and it's actually still a measure of engagement. This is things like not time on site, but sessions, 7-day active users, growth, and that is still the focus. And everything else we're going to be talking about today, it's almost like having the heads of Exxon, BP, and Shell asking about what are you doing to responsibly stop climate change? Again, their business model is to create a society that is addicted, outraged, polarized, performative, and disinformed. That's just the fundamentals of how it works. And while they can try to skim the major harm off the top and do what they can, and we want to celebrate that, we really do, it's just fundamentally that they're trapped in something that they can't change.
Thank you all. Let me turn to my ranking member, Senator Seth. Thank you so much, Senator Blumenthal. We're going to have a second round of questioning that may be participated in only by the ranking member and myself, given that there are votes actively ongoing on the floor. But let me thank our 5 witnesses again and the many members of this subcommittee who have come to question. Ms. Veach, I understand that 70% of the views on YouTube are driven by its recommendation algorithm. with 2 billion users worldwide and over 1 billion hours of video watched each and every day, that makes your recommendation algorithm incredibly powerful. Members of the public can see how many times any video has been viewed, but members of the public can't see how many times a video has been recommended, though I understand YouTube does collect this information and gives it to content providers. So if a video ends up getting taken down by YouTube for violating its content policies, we have no way of knowing how many times it was recommended by your algorithm before it was ultimately removed. Could YouTube commit today to providing more transparency about your recommendation algorithm and its impacts?
Thanks for this question, Senator. So just generally speaking, if content violates our policies, we want to remove it as quickly as possible. As you'll see in our public community guidelines enforcement report, of the 9.3 million videos we removed in Q4 of 2020, more than 70% were removed before they had 10 views. I think you've brought up an interesting idea, and we're always looking to expand transparency when it comes to our platform. One way we've done this recently is by making public what we call our violative view rate. It's the percentage of views on our platform that violate our community guidelines. Last quarter, they were between 0.16 and 0.18%.
Ms. Veach, if I might, I just want to know if you're willing to release the data I believe you're already collecting about how many times videos that violate your content standards have been recommended by your recommendation algorithm.
Thank you, Senator. So I can't commit to releasing that today, but it's an interesting idea. We want to be more transparent, so let us work with you on that.
Thank you. I look forward to getting an answer as soon as is reasonably possible. Ms. Bickert, several publications have reported that significant portions of misinformation and polarizing content on Facebook comes from readily identifiable hyperactive users or super inviters who generate a lot of activity on your platform. Dr. Donovan, can you comment briefly on how these hyperactive users create problems? And then, Ms. Bickert, I want to ask about whether or not Facebook intends to tackle this challenge. Dr. Donovan?
Yeah, you're referring to the BuzzFeed article that reported on an internal memo from Facebook that showed that there's a power law at play where it skews to highly, misinformation tends to be most potent when you have a densely networked and highly coordinated small group of people working essentially around the clock to try to get their groups stocked with the public. And what's been interesting about reading the document internal to Facebook is that even as they tried to counter super inviters, their own internal systems and teams were not able to overcome that coordinated small network. And so there's a lot that the company needs to do to address adversarial movements. And in this case they were looking at the formation of Stop the Steal groups in the Patriot Party.
Thank you, Dr. Donovan. Ms. Bickert, the Wall Street Journal reported last year that Facebook considered seriously but ultimately declined to take measures that would put limits on these users' activities. There was a proposal reportedly called sparing sharing, which would have reduced the spread of content that was disproportionately favored by these so-called hyperactive users. Could you speak to how Facebook is intending to approach this issue?
Yes, Senator. And let me say, we did actually put a restriction, a limit on the number of invites that an individual user could send out in a day to a group during the election period. But I want to speak also to the point that Dr. Donovan raised, and I completely agree. There are networks of bad actors who are particularly sophisticated, who try to use social media to achieve their objectives, and understanding the way that those networks work has been something that we have really been focused on in the past few years, building a team under Nathaniel Gleischer, who's got expertise in this area and I know knows Dr. Donovan as well, in terms of identifying these sophisticated actors who are often engaged in shell games and other attempts to sort of obfuscate what they're doing using inauthentic identities. We've gotten far better at that. We've removed more than 100 such networks since the beginning of 2017. We are public about it when we do. We publish the results of those. And we've also gotten better generally at identifying fake accounts. We remove more than 1 million fake accounts at the time, up or near the time of upload every day now.
Well, thank you. I look forward to delving into this further with you and with other folks at Facebook. Let me just ask 2 more, maybe 3 more, Mr. Ranking Member. A quick, just structural question. I know it's common for employees at major tech companies to be required to sign non-disclosure agreements as a condition of employment. When I was in the private sector, that was a common practice in the businesses that I knew about and practiced for. Ms. Bickert, Ms. Culberson, Ms. Veach, do each of your companies generally require your employees to sign NDAs? Strikes me as a yes or no question.
I'll go first, Senator. I don't know the answer, but I'll follow up. I'll have the team follow up with you.
Senator, I want to be careful here because I'm not a lawyer, an employment lawyer, but I do believe that we have standard agreements to protect proprietary information with our employees.
I'd want to come back to you with the answer, but of course we have certain provisions in place to make sure people aren't sharing private data they might be handling. But I would just say generally the Twittery spirit among our employees is to share their perspectives. You'll oftentimes see our employees tweeting about our different products and services.
Well, thank you. In general, my concern is that if a former employee from one of your companies wants to question or criticize the company or its decision-making, that they might risk facing legal action. And Mr. Harris, Dr. Donovan, I'd welcome some more input from you following this hearing on that dynamic and whether or not NDAs actually prevent some of the most relevant information about algorithms from getting out to the general public. 2 last questions, if I might. One on transparency. I appreciate the information that's been shared today about how algorithms work at a high level. Many independent researchers have said it's critical to know the details, the dials and knobs of algorithms, to understand how components that drive decisions are weighted. So how much a metric like meaningful social interaction is actually correlated with growth and engagement, which, as Mr. Harris has repeatedly asserted, and as I fundamentally believe, the business model of social media requires you to accelerate. So given the immense impact of the knobs and dials of your algorithms in potentially both positive and negative ways, I think greater transparency about those matters, about how your algorithms actually work and about how you make decisions about your algorithms is critical. Ms. Bickert, Ms. Veach, Ms. Culbertson, could you speak to whether your companies are considering the release of more details about this kind of information or other types of enhanced transparency measures or audits about the impact of your company's algorithms moving forward?
I'm happy to start. We are constantly thinking about how we can be more transparent about any actions that we take or our systems in place, including our algorithms. That's why we're investing in our responsible machine learning initiative. We'd be happy to provide more details in the interest of time, but we have an interdisciplinary group at Twitter looking at our algorithms, our machine learning, studying our machine learning. We'll also be sharing some of our findings with the public, so we can be open throughout this process. And then just more broadly, we totally agree that we should be more transparent. We should also provide more consumer control and choice. We're also committed to improving procedural fairness. But to those first 2 points, we've invested in this independent project called Blue Sky, which is aimed at creating open protocols, which would essentially potentially create more controls for the people who use our services, as well as transparency.
Thank you. My last comment will be just this one. Mr. Harris spoke forcefully and pointedly about how the business model of social media is attention harvesting, and that after a decade of the positive and negative impacts of social media, which has accelerated to be one of the most important forces in our society today, that we've more than not seen the toxic impacts of division and disinformation. Mr. Harris has asserted that your entire business model is based on dividing society, and that as we transition into a digitized society in the 21st century, in order for Western open democratic societies to survive. We have to develop model humane standards for how social media works. It is my hope, I'll share with my ranking member, that the next time we convene, it might be to consider what sorts of steps are possible, necessary, or appropriate to make that progress that Mr. Harris speaks about. To my ranking member, Senator Sass.